Welcome to the American Citizens Abroad podcast. I'm Michelle, and today we are chatting with Melissa and Dave of the Strong Sense of Place site, podcast, and blog, and the Library of Lost Time podcast. Welcome. Thanks for chatting with us today.
Thank you so much for asking us. We're always excited to talk about Prague and to talk about books.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's really great to be here.
What brought you to Prague? Have you lived in any other countries?
We've only lived in the United States before we moved to Prague. And how we got here, I don't know, I always feel like we should have a better answer than this, but my great-grandmother is from Slovakia. So I've always been kind of interested in this part of the world, but I feel like saying that gives it much more weight than it actually had. I've just always been attracted to kind of what I perceive as the fairy tale stories and romance of Central Europe, and I find the history really fascinating. For a long time, I wanted to come to Prague, and then we came here on a vacation in 2010 and just fell in love with it. It felt very magical, but also felt like home really quickly. Sometimes you go visiting somewhere and you're like, oh, this place is really great, but I don't think I'd want to live here. And we got here and we were like, oh, we should live here.
The city itself is really beautiful. It's just a lovely city with architecture and the statues, and it kind of wraps around this river, and it looks like just an ancient sort of fairy tale town that's got two castles. It's got an abundance of castles, and the green spaces are really nice. There's a park really close to where we live called Vyšehrad, and I've literally been there hundreds of times, and I never get tired of it. It's got all of these beautiful green spaces, these wonderful views of the city itself. There's also a beer garden. There's a cemetery there that has these ancient graves and artwork. It's just lovely. It's really nice. And then, of course, Prague is central to everything, so we can get a train to Berlin or a train to Budapest or a flight to Paris or what have you. And it's livable. We could get a visa, which was a big step in the right direction. And we did. At least the housing is pretty affordable. It's gotten a little less so in the last few years, but I still think it's probably more affordable than anywhere in the United States that I can think of. So just all around, it was just a sort of a lovely, awesome package for us.
It's noted on your site that you're introverts. I too can be quite introverted, but I found that when I was living abroad, I had to force myself to be extroverted. Has being an introvert posed any issues while you've been living abroad?
That's a really interesting question for me because I kind of always felt like an outsider when I was in the United States. So being here and feeling a little bit on the outside of things feels really like in a way better to me because it's appropriate, right? No matter how long I live here, how many Czech friends I make, I'm never going to be Czech. And so that feels more comfortable because it feels appropriate. Rather than push myself to be more of an extrovert, what I've done is found a couple of organizations that helped me engage in activities that put me around other people, but still felt really comfortable. And I mean, to be fair, I still feel like sometimes magnets have me attached to the couch and I have to work a little bit hard to get out. But there's an organization called Discover Prague, and it's run by this really nice Czech man who wanted to meet expats. So Czech people and expats from all over the world go to his events, and they're things like hikes in the woods and canoeing in the summer and snowshoeing in the winter. And they usually include some kind of cultural or historical aspect to them. It's a little bit of an immersion with people who are native, but also people who are from elsewhere. And like a walk in the woods is my perfect level of interaction because there's a little bit of small talk and then there's lots of just enjoying nature.
The only way I've ever made friends as an adult is by picking something and then routinely showing up for that thing. For instance, when I lived in Texas, I made a bunch of friends through a book club. And when we moved here, one of the things we did was we visited a book club here just to see what that was going to be like and who was going to be there. And after we moved, I joined not that book club, a different book club, as well as board games. I like board games. There are a few reoccurring board game groups in the city. I'll check those out. I have made friends by playing Dungeons and Dragons. There's a group that formed. Some of our best friends are from that. And I just find it's a lovely way to meet people.
What challenges have you faced as Americans living in Prague?
Well, the language is difficult. It's challenging. Experts tell you that in the time it would take an English speaker to learn Czech fluently, they can learn French and Spanish fluently. It's a very challenging language, and there's not a lot of overlap with English at all. One of the things that's challenging about that is that Czechs don't hear a lot of bad Czech. If I approach somebody with my bad Czech, good majority of the Czech people will switch over to English, which is very kind on their part. But from my perspective, I'm like, I wanted to practice my bad Czech. So it's been challenging to sort of get to know that language, which sort of impedes getting to know people a little bit better. I kind of miss small talk.
Which is pretty funny coming from an introvert.
Yeah.
I remember the first day you said that to me, that you were like, I kind of miss chit-chatting and making the small talk when I'm at a store or something. And I was like, wow, I actually love that no one talks to me.
Yeah, I didn't notice it until I went back to the States. And I was like, oh, it's nice to be able to just say, hey, how's it going? So I would say that's kind of one of the major barriers. I also miss American bacon. But there are a number of delights here that make up for that. So
I love the challenge you face living abroad.
It's the language.
You can't get American bacon.
And then the bacon.
I actually found the transition to getting adjusted here much easier than I thought it was going to be. I had a lot of anxiety before we moved about if we were going to make friends and how confusing things were going to be and how much of an adjustment it was going to be. Because I don't know if I'm going to blame it on introversion, but we really like research. We don't make any decisions spontaneously. So we were thinking about this move for years. We watched a lot of international house hunters, which made it feel really doable.
We also did a lot of reading, and we came over here many times and stayed for weeks at a time to figure it out. There's one telling of our story that's we came to Prague, we loved it, and we figured out how to move here. And there's another telling of our story is we came to Prague, we thought about it for about 8 years and figured out how to do it. And then we moved here.
And by the time we actually moved, we knew the neighborhoods pretty well because we'd visited several times. We'd gone to the grocery store. As Dave said, we went to a book club when we were here on vacation once. So we could see like ways we could integrate ourselves. And that made it a lot easier.
Let's talk about your site, podcast, and blog. What's unique is that these all marry books with travel. For our audience, could you expand on the concept behind Strong Sense of Place to explain it better than I did? And what is the inspiration behind it all?
So every episode of Strong Sense of Place, we introduce one destination somewhere in the world. We tell you why you might want to visit and what makes that place different from every other place on Earth. And then we talk about 5 books we love that took us there on the page. So far, we've done 60 destinations all over the world.
We're in our 6th season. Every season's 12 episodes. And we do a mix of geographical destinations and then also sprinkle in a couple of places you can visit that aren't found on the map. So trains or the circus or hotels, just to kind of mix it up a little bit. The reason we started this project, I think, is twofold. One, we made the conscious decision when we moved here that we were going to travel a lot more. And the way I like to prepare for travel is to read novels. And the way Dave likes to prepare for travel, generally speaking, is nonfiction. And we realized that we were both reading all of these books and we could talk to each other about them. But hey, wouldn't it be fun to talk to other people about them too?
Also, the books kind of inform each other, which is interesting.
It is really interesting. I'll come across something in a novel and be telling him about it. And then he will tell me the actual real life history or true facts about the thing that I've just described a fictional character experiencing.
Also, on top of that, I think we find the world delightful, right? We try to approach every destination with curiosity and empathy And then we try to bring that to the podcast. We try to traffic in delight, we say.
We just recently recorded our episode about Mongolia. All I knew about Mongolia before we started doing our research was that I'd seen the pictures of the very majestic looking people on horses with an eagle sitting on their arm. And now, 2 weeks later, I'm asking myself, how soon can we get to Mongolia? When am I going to try the salty tea? And this is a pretty typical experience of what happens when we do these shows. One of our most popular shows is the one we did about Iran. Obviously, that's not a place that people are going to be able to visit right now, but the history is fascinating, and the culture and the stories and the tradition of telling stories there. And I think us getting excited about that and then being able to share that with other people has just been a great experience for us, and it's really rewarding for the audience too.
So do you recommend reading books relating to a certain location before, during, or after one's visit to that location?
All of them. The thing I like about reading them before is that it can give you ideas about what you might want to see or do when you're there. You get a background on the culture and the history. I think if you do that kind of research before you go, you get a lot more out of the visit when you're there. But it's also really rewarding to read a book set in the place that you're visiting and kind of be experiencing it in real time. I had that experience when we went to Barcelona last year. I was reading the book, The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. And a lot of that book takes place in the Gothic quarter of Barcelona. And we were walking in those streets. We were in a courtyard that's described in the book. And it just makes it, for me, really impactful and fun and really fires up my imagination. Because I kind of want to live in my own little fantasy world a lot of the time anyway. And it's kind of a collision of real life and imagination when that happens. And then when you get home, it's really fun to read a book set in that destination and kind of relive the experience of being there. And I think for me, it really helps ground my memories so that everything feels a little bit more vivid when I look back on that trip, because it's kind of reinforced when you get home and you've had time to process everything. So I say all of it.
Plus, we always like to imagine that we'll be back.
Yeah. Rick Steves, who we call our travel uncle, always says, assume you'll be back. So it can be really fun when you find new things you want to do in that place after you've gotten home, because you're like, okay, now I have a good reason to go back.
So what are your top 5 favorite pairings of book and place?
You want to start?
Sure. So for our Sri Lanka episode, I had never really thought all that much about Sri Lanka. Like, I knew where it was. But then I read this book, Elephant Complex by John Gimlet. Salon called him the world's best living travel writer, and they might be right. He is just a very good travel writer. He does this amazing job of sort of combining the skills of an extrovert and talking to seemingly everybody in Sri Lanka and getting their story, and the eye for detail of an introvert. And he marries those things together in these stories. And he told the history of Sri Lanka, and he talked about going places. He told a story about sitting in a tree all night as he was surrounded by the wildlife of Sri Lanka. And that made me think 2 things. One is, that sounds awesome and I'd like to do that. And the second is, I don't think I'm ever going to do that, but it's really great to hear that somebody else has. And I just love that book. It's a great book. And it's made me really want to consider going to Sri Lanka as soon as possible.
Which is an unusual thing for us to say, because neither of us really likes to be hot. But yes, the idea of Sri Lanka is very attractive now that we did that episode.
Yeah.
I'm going to the opposite extreme with the climate, and I picked Iceland, and a really amazing book set in Iceland. I feel like Iceland has this otherworldly vibe when you're there, and I love a book that puts me into a chilly environment. So I picked a book called The Tricking of Freya by Christina Sunley. This is kind of a tricky one because it starts out like a family saga and it's told from the perspective of a little girl. So it's almost like a kid's memoir. It almost feels like the novel Jane Eyre at the beginning because she's a little girl in this kind of unusual family circumstance. And then about a third of the way into the book, it turns into this big outdoor adventure. And the descriptions of Iceland are so vivid, you can almost feel the cool, fresh air on your face. And the writer does an amazing job of threading stories from the Icelandic sagas into her story, but in a way that feels really natural and is really interesting and accessible. It's like a literary trick, but it's a very readable book. And it's funny and heartbreaking and just a fantastic marriage of story and setting. Anybody interested in Iceland or who likes nested narratives with stories inside of stories would love this book.
I also wanted to mention a book that I read for Spain called The Ladies in Waiting, which is a graphic novel. It is about the artist Diego Velázquez, who made a painting called The Ladies in Waiting, which is in the Prado in Madrid. You don't need to go to the Prado in Madrid to appreciate this book. It's a really great book about Diego's life and his work and how he came to paint this one amazing painting. After a lifetime of doing portraits for royalty, he did a painting which broke everything that came before it. Some people have called it the most important painting of all time. And the graphic novel explores that painting and talks about how it came to be and what it means and the reactions of artists after that. So how it affected Dali and Picasso. And I went to see that painting, and the combination of sort of having the experience of reading the graphic novel and then standing in front of the painting itself just added a whole lot of dimension to the work, and it made it make sense. And it was kind of amazing to see it in relation to his other work there. But I would definitely recommend, if you're interested in art history, absolutely take a look. It's The Ladies in Waiting.
There's all this research about how anticipation of vacations in some ways is even more pleasurable than actually being on that trip. And I really love the way reading before you go kind of heightens the anticipation and in a way introduces you to the things you're going to see so that when you see them in real life, they somehow are like even more vivid, I think, because you have an idea of what it might look like or feel like or smell like, and then you experience it in real life and it's different or more or better or even if it's not, like it gives you a frame of reference, I think.
Yeah.
That is really interesting.
Close a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My next pick is a book that I keep shoving into people's hands. I can't stop advocating for it. It's set in Italy and it's called Still Life by the author Sarah Winman. It's definitely on my all-time favorites list. I just read it, I think, a year and a half ago, but it's going to be a companion for me for a while. It's a found family story, and it starts during World War II with a young British man who is fighting the war in Italy. He returns to London after the war, and he gets this mysterious and completely surprising inheritance of a house in Florence. And he works at a pub, and he's like, what am I going to do with this house in Florence? And his friends are like, go there.
Yeah.
So this kind of ragtag group of friends and family relocate to this house that he's been gifted in Florence. It's set in the 1960s, this part. It's just their life story. It's everyday life among these incredibly kind, interesting people who have tough conversations and still love each other even when they're saying things that they don't want to hear. And the descriptions of Florence are so vivid. If you read Still Life and then you read A Room with a View by E.M. Forster, you will be convinced you need to at least visit Florence and, I don't know, maybe live there. maybe get someone to mysteriously leave you a house so you can live there.
I'm in favor of that.
There's one more that I want to mention. It's a cookbook. So my little secret tip is if you're going somewhere, find a coffee table cookbook about that place, because it often will tell you a lot about the culture and the history, all in the context of food. And we love to eat. So cookbooks are a really fun way to kind of armchair travel or prepare for real travel.
It'll give you some food to look forward to too.
Exactly. Yeah. Tell you what to order when you get there. I recently read a book called Dishoom, which is set in like it's a story. It does tell a story. It's about the food scene in Mumbai now, but also what the cafe scene was like in old Bombay in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Bombay, for people who don't know, Bombay is now Mumbai. And this is a really unusual cookbook because it's written like a travel guide. Each chapter takes you on a walking tour through the current city of Mumbai, and then time travels back to old Bombay and talks about what you might have seen and done if you were there in history. And then it recommends where to eat now and also includes recipes. So it's this really interesting mix of travelogue and storytelling and food culture and recipes. And then there are Dishoom restaurants in the UK. So you can read this book, feel like maybe you've eaten in India, and then go to the UK and eat in the restaurant. Pretty magical. As you can tell from the books we've been recommending, when we're looking for books for the show, we are really looking for books that fill the whole spectrum of what you would find in the bookstore. History and graphic novels and biographies and memoirs and every genre of fiction. I'm always on the hunt for a really good crime novel because left to my own devices, that's what I read. So I'm looking for crime novels with really vivid settings.
I read a fantasy book for India that I really loved.
Mm-hmm. And it's really fun when you find those because they present kind of a non-traditional picture of the place, and they usually have a lot of atmosphere. And we're also looking for books that are not just name dropping the place. We want a story that could only happen in that destination. In the best circumstances, the story grows out of where it's grounded instead of just saying, we're in Times Square, but the story could take place anywhere.
I need to ask, what are your favorite bookstores in Prague or globally?
Dave, you want to start?
Sure. I really like curated bookstore, something where somebody has clearly taken a lot of love in picking out the different books. One of my favorite is in Edinburgh. It's called Typewriter. It's run by P. Hodges, and they are just a lovely person. They're always there all the times I've been there. You'll walk in and they'll frequently offer you tea or a cake of some sort. And it's a small place. There's only a couple of rooms, but every book in there has clearly met some kind of bar. Mm-hmm. You walk in there and you can pick any book on any shelf and it's going to be a good read. It's just a delightful place and sort of tucked into like a walk down off a street in Edinburgh, not too far from the city center, but it just feels like the entire city is sort of perched on top of of this place, and it's just delightful.
The founders also really made a commitment to being part of the bookish community. So they have a lot of events there. They have a little publishing arm where they put out weird little books. They have a printing arm where you can print zines. Very groovy and fun.
Yeah.
And it started in a police call box like the TARDIS from Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Before the founder T had a permanent location. So the whole thing just has a very magical vibe about it.
Yeah.
I really like used bookstores. And I have two favorites that I want to mention for people who might be traveling. There's a English language used bookstore in Munich called the Munich Readery. And it also is very well curated. I went in there and found probably 20 of my all-time favorites on the shelves and came home with 8 of those because You can't put 20 books in a carry-on, much to my chagrin.
Yeah.
And it's a very cozy spot. It has a lot of easy chairs and there are oriental rugs on the floor. And right across the street is a really sweet cafe that has a retro feel to it. It's got the black and white tiled floor, and the waiters wear white shirts and little black bow ties, and they make a very good homemade hot chocolate. So if you're ever in Munich, hit the Readery for some books, cross the street for hot chocolate. You'll be happy forever. And then in Wigton, Scotland, Wigton is a national book town. It has, I think, 24 bookstores now. And there's also a bookshop where you can rent it through Airbnb and run the bookshop for a week. It's a really fun spot. We did it with a group of friends a few years ago, and you just kind of become part of the book selling community in the town for a few days. And one of the shops there is called Well Read Books. And it was started by this woman named Ruth Anderson, who is a former barrister. She's got her barrister's wig in the shop. And she just has the best. She also very carefully curates her books. So anything you pull off the shelf is going to be a good read. And the space is really fun because it also has comfy couches and chairs, but it has this rambling feel to it because there's a main room and then there's a little side room. And it just feels very cozy.
And it's across the street from a diner that makes really lovely bacon sarnie.
Yes. Always the food with the books. You're sensing the theme here, right? I also want to shout out Daunt Books in London.
Yeah.
Because Daunt Books on Marylebone is like Strong Sense of Place came into the real world. Daunt organizes its books by destination, and they mix together travel guides, memoirs, and fiction. So you can say, I want to explore books in Thailand, and go to the Thailand shelf, and everything is shelved together. And it's in a really beautiful building with stained glass windows and this little sweet staircase. And everyone who works there is very excited about books. So Daunt Books in London is also fantastic.
And so what is on your reading list for this summer? And does your travel itinerary match?
It does not. We are...
Speak for yourself, Dave.
Okay. Mine does not. We are in production on the show right now. I'm doing a lot of reading for the show. Right now I'm reading a book called Born to be Hanged by Keith Thompson for our Panama episode. It's an adventure story about a bunch of pirates trying to save a native princess. It's really
such a good setup.
Yeah, it's really fun. And they get into all kinds of pirate trouble, as you might imagine. And it's nonfiction. This actually happened. I also just finished Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. That's for our Norway episode. That's just Neil doing what he does with the myths of Norway, and it's all charming and awesome. We are headed out to vacation in a couple of weeks. I'm probably still going to be reading for the show, but I'm kind of hoping to slip in The Ministry of Time by Kaylee Ann Bradley. That's a story about a woman who hosts a time-traveling sailor in modern-day Britain. He is from, I think, the 1600s, and they have brought him through time, and now she's going to take care of him, and it's a little bit of a rom-com. It's a little bit of a commentary about current social issues. It's very fun, and I'm looking forward to getting through that.
When we're doing the show, our production schedule takes about 6 months. So about half the year, our reading is really dictated by what is on the schedule. And Dave reads 2 books. Well, Dave talks about 2 books on each episode, and I recommend 3. So between the 2 of us, we have to find 5 books that we love. And to find those 5, we read a lot more than 5.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which can be a little bit heartbreaking, but is also kind of fun because we get to read very widely. There is no tragedy in our world like reading an entire book, getting to the end and saying, well, I didn't love that, so I have to find another one for the show. I am really hoping that when we go on holiday at the end of July, that I will be able to do some reading just purely for fun. We're going to Venice, Slovenia, Croatia, and Paris. And I originally thought that I would pick out 2 books that I might want to read on that trip. And my list currently has about 20 titles on it. So I might be in a little bit of trouble there.
We've made some reading time for ourselves by taking the train down and back.
Yeah.
But
A lot of train time.
Not 20 bucks worth of train time.
I mean, I can read kind of quickly, but not that quickly. Daphne du Maurier's name might be familiar to some people. She's the author of the Gothic classic Rebecca. It's been made into a movie a couple of times, and I feel like it's kind of like the gateway drug for people who are curious about Gothic novels. Maybe they've read Jane Eyre and they've heard Rebecca is kind of a cousin to Jane Eyre. Anyway, she wrote a short story that's set in Venice called Don't Look Now, that is going to be what I'm reading when we're on the ferry to Venice. Like, that is going to happen. I don't care if we're still in the throes of production on our show. I'm reading that short story on the ferry.
Don't Look Now is a much better title than Rebecca.
Yeah. And we're going to Slovenia, and there aren't a lot of books set in Slovenia. I feel like some people aren't aware how awesome Slovenia is. It's so pretty. It's such a lovely country. And I found this novel called Billiards at the Hotel Dobre by someone named Dusan Sharotar, which is a great name. And it's set during World War II at a hotel. And I love books set in hotels. Really any enclosed environment, a train, a hotel, a ship, an apartment building. I just like the way the drama kind of gets heightened when nobody can leave, like throw in a storm or something, and it's like catnip for me. I'm pretty excited about reading that book when we're in Slovenia. And then I do love a book set on a train, and we're going to be on the train for a long time. So there's this new book called The Main Character by Jacqueline Goldis. And it's a modern murder mystery, but it's an homage to Golden Age crime stories, so like Agatha Christie. And the story's actually set on a renovated version of the Orient Express. So I feel like that's very promising. It's kind of begging to be read on the overnight train from Venice. I mean, let's be honest.
Any other ones you want to add?
I mean, I do have one more. I always have 12 more, but I'll only talk about one more. So Daniel Silva is an American author who writes spy novels featuring a master spy named Gabriel Olan. And Gabriel is not only a master spy in the world of these books, he's also one of the world's best art restorers, which always makes Dave laugh when I say that.
It just seems like an unusual combination of skills and background.
He has to have a cover. And he was an artist before he became a spy.
Yeah.
So he's very good at art restoration and killing people. I don't see what the problem is.
I mean,
It's a great series. One of the things that Daniel Silva, the author, does really well is the stories are jet setting all over Europe and into Washington, D.C. and New York a lot of the time. But it's not just name dropping. He does a really good job of recreating those settings so that you actually feel like you are with the team as they're moving through these spaces. And he puts out a new book every July. And I take a little personal holiday when the book comes out, lie down in front of the fan and read it from beginning to end in one sitting if I can. So that will be happening in July. And the new one is called Death in Cornwall. And they often include some kind of art hijinks. So this one is set in Cornwall. I suspect there will be lots of dramatic cliffs and crashing surf. And I know that there's a stolen Picasso involved in the story. I'm really looking forward to that. Every July is like Gabriel Olan holiday.
Do you guys have any thoughts on books, on places, or in general that you'd like to share?
I have a very strong piece of advice for readers who love to read and people who think maybe they don't like to read. And that is, life is too short to read books that you're not enjoying. So if you're reading something and you're having a hard time bringing yourself back to picking it up, quit early, quit often. nobody is tracking your reading unless you're getting a degree or something. You should be able to enjoy the books that you read. They should fire up your curiosity, make you think about the world in a different way, help you have fun, be an escape, help you see the world in a new way. All of those wonderful things. And if a book's not doing that, release it so someone else can enjoy it and find a book that does work for you.
The trick that I've found there is to forgive myself for picking up the book in the first place and just being like, it's not for me right now.
Yeah.
And you move on. You do a different thing. Related audiobooks and graphic novels totally count as books. If you want to get through a book and you find you're only able to get through the audiobook, there are a lot of books that are better in an audio format, particularly some of the older ones, like I'll mention Jane Eyre, that kind of era, the Charles Dickens stuff. If you want to read that, it's a really excellent experience to try to listen to the audiobook. Many of those books were presented in that way the first time around. Audible has recordings of some books that are large cast presentations, which might also work for some people. I enjoyed the Dracula one, but it's going to depend on you, of course, whether you want to hear the one voice or the many. Give it a shot. Try it out. And don't let anybody guilt you into thinking that you're not reading when you're reading.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. You guys are so much fun.
Thank you. It was really fun to talk about books with you today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
The American Citizens Abroad podcast is a monthly podcast that is published the second Tuesday of each month. It is edited and produced by me, Michelle, and is a product of American Citizens Abroad. You can find us on Twitter at ACA_podcast, on Facebook at American Citizens Abroad Podcast, or you can email us at podcast@americansabroad.org. Remember, give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts so other Americans living abroad can find us.